Hello juniors, and welcome back to another lesson in U.S. history. Today we are continuing and finishing up our lesson on the civil rights movement. The first person I want to talk about today is a man by the name of Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. I'll explain later on why he changed his name to the letter X. He was born in Omaha in 1925, and then in 1929 his home was set fire and burned to the ground, and his father was found dead, murdered near some train tracks. He was murdered by a group of white supremacists, but police let the men off because, well, they decided that both incidents were accidents. Later on, after serving 7 years in prison for a burglary charge, Malcolm's brother Reginald would visit and discuss his recent conversion to Islam. Reginald belonged to the religious organization known as the Nation of Islam. Malcolm was intrigued, and he began to study the teachings of the Nation of Islam's leader, Elijah Muhammad. Muhammad taught that white society was actively working to keep African Americans from empowering themselves in achieving political and economic and social success and independence. By the time he was paroled in 1952, Malcolm was a true believer in the Nation of Islam, and he changed his last name from Little to X. To him, Little was his slave name. X was the name of his lost tribe, the name that he would never know. Malcolm X was intelligent, articulate, and charismatic, which made him an excellent choice as a spokesperson for the Nation of Islam. And with Malcolm X as the face of the organization, the numbers for the Nation of Islam swelled from about 500 to 30,000. During that time, Malcolm X befriended and ministered to a boxer by the name of Cassius Clay. That boxer eventually decided to convert to Islam and join the Nation of Islam. And in February of 1964, Cassius Clay announced he changed his name to Muhammad Ali. Eventually, Malcolm X had a falling out with the Nation of Islam. It came to light and to Malcolm's attention that the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad, was having affairs with multiple women within the Nation of Islam, and with those women had several illegitimate children. Now, Muhammad had taught that all men and women should be celibate until they're married, but had not practiced that himself. And so, to Malcolm X, this was a great betrayal, and, well, to him, delegitimized the entire organization. In March of 1964, Malcolm X officially left the Nation of Islam and started his own religious organization, the Muslim Mosque Incorporated. As a civil rights leader, Malcolm X expressed the bitterness and anger that so many African Americans felt during the major phase of the civil rights movement from 1955 to 1965. He preached on the streets of Harlem and spoke at places like Harvard and even Oxford. He was intelligent and witty and very, very sincere about his beliefs that many considered radical. He was a formidable critic of American society and also a critic of Martin Luther King Jr. Malcolm X did not see eye to eye with Dr. King on the issues of integration and nonviolence. Malcolm X argued that more was at stake than just the right to sit at a counter at a restaurant. It was more important that African Americans be able to express and live out a black identity and to have true integrity and a real independence. In contrast to Dr. King's message of nonviolence, Malcolm X preached that black people in America should defend themselves by any means necessary. In 1964, Malcolm X went on a pilgrimage to Mecca. This is a common practice among believers of Islam. And there, his life was changed. Malcolm X met with many different people from many different backgrounds, and he was able to express himself to these people and found they were willing to listen. And there he encountered people that did not look like him. In fact, people who had blonde hair and blue eyes. He found people that didn't look like him that he could call brother. And when he returned to the United States, his tone began to change. He spoke more favorably about integration and no longer only preached to African Americans, but he began preaching to all people. After Malcolm had left the Nation of Islam and renounced the prophet Elijah Muhammad, his relationship between that group and his own group was very tense. In fact, the FBI, which had infiltrated the Nation of Islam, found out that there were plans to assassinate Malcolm X. And after several attempts, eventually they were successful. At a speaking engagement in Manhattan in February of 1965, 3 gunmen rushed the stage where Malcolm X was speaking and shot him 15 times. He was pronounced dead on arrival at the New York Columbia Presbyterian Hospital at the age of 39. His martyrdom and his ideas and his speeches contributed to the development of a movement of Black nationalism, an ideology that would encourage groups like the Black Power movement and help popularize the values and ideas of independence among African Americans in the 1960s and the 1970s. The ability to vote had always been something that white supremacists and white leaders in the South had actively worked to discourage among Black Americans. Most often, this took the form of complicating the process to get registered to vote using literacy tests, forcing people to try and recite the Constitution. The Southern Christian Leadership Council, or the SCLC, who Martin Luther King Jr. was the president of, was focused on getting Black citizens registered to vote. And in one particular city, Selma, Alabama, this issue was very apparent. Only 2% of eligible Black voters were registered. Now, adjacent to this upcoming protest was another protest, the protest of the arrest of James Orange. Jimmy Lee Jackson was a part of a march on Marion, Alabama, in protest of this arrest. And as the protesters were marching, the officials turned off nearby streetlights. State troopers then rushed the protesters. Jimmy Lee and his mother fled to a cafe. And then Corporal James Fowler followed them. And there shot Jimmy Lee Jackson. And thus a march was organized, a march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery, Alabama, the capital, to confront Governor Wallace and ask him whether or not he had given the order to turn off the lights in Marion and then lead to the death of Jimmy Lee Jackson. The march was organized. 600 people met on Sunday, March 7th, 1965 in Selma, Alabama. And they marched slowly, solemnly, and quietly across Edmund Pettus Bridge. And that's when they were met with violence. Alabama state troopers ordered the marchers to turn back, claiming that this was an unlawful march. But they refused. They stood there, unmoving, refusing to turn around. And then the state troopers advanced. They pulled out nightsticks, whips, and clubs and began to beat the marchers, attacking them. This day will be known as Bloody Sunday. This brutal scene was captured on television, and Americans and people from all races saw what was happening and were horrified. On March 9th, Dr. King led another march, 2,000 marchers, black and white, across Edmund Pettus Bridge, but found again Highway 80 blocked by state troopers. King paused the march, led them in a prayer, and then turned around. That day was known as Turnaround Tuesday. King received some criticism, but it was believed that the state troopers were trying to trick the marchers into coming across the bridge and then planning to attack them again. And then that night, a group of segregationists attacked and beat a white minister by the name of James Reeb, and they beat him to death. Governor George Wallace tried to prevent the march from happening, but a U.S. District Court ruled that it was legal and that it was going to happen. 6 days later, on March 15th, President Johnson addressed the nation, and he pledged his support for the marchers in Selma. And he told Americans, there is no Negro problem. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. Their cause must be our cause too. Because it's not just Negroes, but really it's all of us who must overcome the crippling legacy of bigotry and injustice, and we shall overcome. That moment when the President of the United States declared "We shall overcome," the anthem of the civil rights movement, spoken through the lips of the president, that was a signal that change was coming. Several days later, on March 21st, another march was organized. 2,000 people set out from Selma, protected by the U.S. Army and Alabama National Guard that Johnson had federalized. After walking 12 hours a day and sleeping in fields along the way, they reached Montgomery on March 25th, where nearly 50,000 supporters, black and white, met the marchers in Montgomery, where they gathered at the steps of the state capitol to hear Dr. King and others speak. That August, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Johnson later signed it. Specifically, the act banned literacy tests as a requirement for voting. It mandated federal oversight of voter registration in areas where tests had previously been used, and gave the U.S. Attorney General the duty of challenging the use of poll taxes for state and local elections. Another pivotal moment in the civil rights movement was when Thurgood Marshall became the first African American to be confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. During his 24-year period as a Supreme Court justice, Justice Marshall consistently challenged discrimination based on race or sex. He opposed the death penalty and supported the rights of criminal defendants. I mean, this was a huge win. The Supreme Court, the civil rights movement was, in the thick of it. And in 1967, it really needed a win. And they got it. Associate Justice Marshall retired in 1991, and then he passed away 2 years later. In the last years of his life, Dr. Martin Luther King faced a lot of criticism, a lot of it coming from the black community. People who were listening to the words of Malcolm X and the Black Power movement that weren't convinced that nonviolence was the way that they were going to get what they wanted in the end. In the spring of 1968, when King and other members of the SCLC were planning a demonstration and a march on Washington, they were called to the city of Memphis, Tennessee, to support some sanitation workers that had gone on strike. On the night of April 3rd, King gave his final speech at the Mason Temple Church in Memphis. Listening to the speech is kind of odd because it appears as though King is almost sort of predicting his own untimely end. In the final words of his speech, King says, "I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we, as a people, will get to the promised land. And I am happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord." At 6:05 p.m. the next day, King was standing on the second floor balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, with some of his associates. Then a shot rang out, and a bullet struck King in the neck. The shot was fired by a man named James Earl Ray, who was later captured in June in the city of London. King was rushed to the hospital, where he was pronounced dead about an hour later. He died at the age of 39. There was a tremendous amount of shock and distress when news spread of King's death. There was rioting in more than 100 cities around the country, including burning and looting. Amid a wave of national mourning, Johnson urged Americans to reject the blind violence that had killed King, whom he called the apostle of nonviolence. Johnson also called on Congress to speedily pass legislation called the Fair Housing Act, that would cement King's legacy and prohibit just rental and financing of housing based upon race, religion, nationality, or sex. Even though black and white Americans mourned the death of Dr. King, his killing served to widen this gap and rift between black and white people in the United States. Many black Americans saw the killing of King as a total rejection of King's nonviolent movement. Like the death of Malcolm X, the killing of Dr. King led to a resurgence in the Black Power movement and the Black Panther Party in the late 60s and early 1970s. King remained the most widely known and respected African American leader during the Civil Rights Movement. A campaign to establish a national holiday honoring Dr. King was put in motion almost immediately after his death. President Ronald Reagan would sign the bill cementing King's holiday into law in 1983. As our unit on the civil rights movement comes to a close, I want to leave you with the words of a song that emerged out of the civil rights movement. It was written by Sam Cooke. He only played it live to an audience one time, and he died before it was released on his posthumous album, Ain't That Good News. The song is called Change Is Gonna Come. I was born by the river in a little tent. Oh, and just like the river, I've been running ever since. It's been a long time coming. But I know a change is gonna come. Oh, yes, it will. Thank you for joining me today. I'm so glad you could be here. I love you all. Make it a great day.